Yes, for people who don't know Ipsos, we're in 90 countries. I was in charge of Ipsos Mori in the UK, and for a strange quirk of fate, I've ended up as global chief executive of 18,000 people in 90 countries. And I was just reflecting, and really interesting listening to the previous speakers. I mean, my watchword is the quote by Peter Drucker, which all of you will be familiar with, that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and then it has structure for lunch. I think it may not even be by Peter Drucker, but it's a great quote. And so I think the data on this is so unequivocal. And in my own career, I've stayed in the same company for 34 years. So I'm relatively unusual, having started as a trainee and ended up as global CEO. But I think what's so clear, and I'm a person who relies on data. So very briefly, if you look at knowledge workers, which is what, and professional organisations, which is what we're talking about here, we obviously are living through a really interesting moment with the end of the taboo against remote working. It's very different in different countries. I'm sitting in Paris, where there is a culture of actually trying to check who is in the office, because some of the French management here don't believe that people work except when they're present at a desk, which is quite an interesting idea if you're British or American. So handling that across our network is interesting. And I think this point about cultural competence is hugely important. And the more diverse the organization, in some ways, the more challenging it is. And just had an interesting episode with an Indian team where they're feeling their dignity is affronted because people are asking questions about quality or money. But overall, if you look at what the data shows us about leadership across cultures, actually human beings in most countries have more in common than they have that divides them. And as we're probably got a lot of people listening in the UK, I think the data is very clear. And if you look at the performance of organizations, and we've done this in a number of sectors, the data shows very clearly that there is actually very little correlation between how happy you are with your pay, or the average employee's happiness with their pay, and the performance of the organization. There's very little correlation with whether or not your boss is nice and the performance and the overall performance of the organization. There's very little correlation, interestingly, on the amount of perceived bureaucracy in an organization and actually what its overall performance looks like. So I found that really interesting, because we all want more pay all the time, but actually a lot in many large organizations, we concentrate all the flexible pay on the people at the top, and most of whom are never going to leave. And that's something I'm certainly going to be working on in my tenure as global chief executive. And we don't actually reward perhaps some of the people further down the chain with enough flexible remuneration. But anyway, what the data does show, however, very, very clearly, is that the correlates with high-performing organizations are, perhaps unsurprisingly, around communications. So it's about 5 times higher in the top performers, the proportion of people who feel they're being kept well informed, than in the worst performers. A very strong correlation with a sense of autonomy and control. And the data on this, again, we've known this for over a century. There was a very early study of life expectancy in Her Majesty's Treasury around the turn of the century, at the beginning of the 20th century. And what it showed is that the permanent secretary and the senior people at the top tended, on average, and they're all working in the same building, to live about 10 years longer than the people at the bottom of the organization. And so they're all, in 1900 or so, they were mostly men. But the men at the top who were in control were living much longer than the clerks and people whose lives didn't have control. And I think a challenge in professional services is how we get the work done while giving people that sort of sense of autonomy. We know we don't make plants grow faster by pulling them out by the roots and having a look every 5 minutes. But I do have some managers who have tendencies in that direction, which will have to be stopped. And then, another key correlate with high performance is freedom to innovate. But obviously, I can't have, in 90 countries of their own IT strategy, 90 countries of their own protocols, 90 countries trying out new software all the time in 90 different types of software. So again, one needs to control it, but people have to feel that they can do new things. So those are some key things. And then finally, because I think I'll be short, is one of the other overarching things that comes out of this is that clarity about the overall goals of the organization. People want to feel part of something that's bigger than themselves. And so when you look at an organization like Tesco at the height of its powers in the past, where it was taking, I think, 9% of all retail spending in the United Kingdom, that motto of every little helps ran like a golden thread through the organization, because people were appraised on what have you done today to make things better for the company, for customers, whether they were stacking shelves, driving a lorry, running a store, buying fruit, you name it, that sort of absolute clarity. And what we see when we compare organizations is that the top performers, again, are about 40% more likely to have everybody in the organization clear about the overall goals, not the goals of their team or their department. And there's only a very weak, you can be running a terrible hospital where you're 10 times more likely to kill people than a brilliant hospital. And everybody in the oncology department or everybody in orthopedics will say that we know what we're doing in orthopedics. But when you look at the best hospitals, the one that you and I would want to be treated in, you will find that the top ones have a bigger goal about, and everybody from the porter who's taking the bodies to the mortuary to the brain surgeon has a sort of shared understanding. You see it in commercial organizations, whether they're supermarkets, manufacturing companies. If you look at Google or Apple, there will be clarity about what they're trying to do. So, and spending time on that, and it's something I've learned in my own career, is really, really important. People want to feel part of something that's bigger than themselves, but also bigger than their small immediate team. And if you get that stuff right, you'll do well. I will shut up. Wish me luck.